एक बार देख लेना इसको।
History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Good morning, everybody. It is my absolute honor to welcome you all to the Professor K.M. Ashraf Memorial Lecture. I, Manya, alongside Harsh, will be your co-hosts for this session. The Professor K.M. Ashraf Memorial Lecture will be followed by a national seminar on the theme Traditions in Transition, Customs, Rituals, Reforms and Resistance in Indian History, organized by Legacy, the History Society of Kirori College. This lecture series celebrates the contributions of Professor K.M. Ashraf, whose scholarship continues to inspire generations of historians, making this lecture series a fitting tribute to his enduring contributions. The Professor K.M. Ashraf Memorial Lecture stands as one of Delhi University's oldest academic lecture series. According to available records, this lecture series was first instituted in 1966 with its inaugural address delivered by eminent historian Professor Muhammad Habib. After nearly 4 decades of dormancy, Legacy, the History Society of KMC revived this lecture series in 2012, although on a modest scale, focusing primarily on recollections of Ashraf's time at the college. Distinguished scholars such as Professor Harman's Mukhya, Professor Arjun Dev, and Mr. Zahur Siddiqui, who were his students, participated in this revival. Since 2013, the Professor K.M. Ashraf Memorial Lecture has been held annually without interruption, featuring 12 lectures by some of India's most distinguished historians. The most recent lecture in 2024 was delivered by Professor Upinder Singh on Women's World's Views on Inscriptions.
आज हम एक महान इतिहासकार, स्वतंत्रता सेनानी कुंवर मोहम्मद अशरफ की विरासत को स्मरण करते हुए यहाँ एकत्रित हुए। वे न केवल एक इतिहासकार थे, बल्कि भारत के राष्ट्रीय आंदोलन में उन्होंने सक्रिय भूमिका भी निभाई। उनका जुड़ाव पंडित जवाहरलाल नेहरू और नेताजी सुभाष चंद्र बोस जैसे नेताओं के साथ रहा। 1956 से 1960 तक उन्होंने किरोड़ी कॉलेज के इतिहास विभाग का नेतृत्व किया और अकादमिक शोध को एक नई दिशा दी। नेहरू के अनुरोध पर उन्होंने कश्मीर के इतिहास पर गहन शोध भी किया, जो इस क्षेत्र की इतिहास लेखन परंपरा में एक महत्वपूर्ण योगदान भी साबित हुआ। कुंवर मोहम्मद अशरफ की स्मृति में स्थापित यह व्याख्यान श्रृंखला उनके योगदान और ऐतिहासिक दृष्टिकोण को जीवंत बनाए रखने का हमारा एक प्रयास है।
Kubar Muhammad Ashraf's legacy lies in his unconventional commitment to subaltern and people's history at a time when mainstream historiography was dominated by elitist narratives. As a historian, writer, and a socialist thinker, his contributions continue to inspire scholars who seek to recover the voices of the oppressed and challenge orthodox historical discourses. This august gathering extends its immense gratitude to our guests, Professor Amar Farooqui, Dr. Iliyas, our respected principal sir, Professor Dinesh Khattar, our teacher in charge, Dr. Vikram Singh Chaudhary, and our staff advisor, Dr. Sanjay Kumar, for their unwavering support and guidance. We are also honored to be joined by our distinguished faculty members, Dr. Shahana Bhattacharya, Dr. Sanjay Verma, Dr. Puneet Yadav, Dr. Ajit Jha, and Dr. Sunil.
शुभम करोति कल्याणम आरोग्यम धन संपद शत्रु बुद्धि विनाशाय दीप ज्योति नमोस्तुते। अब इस शुभ अवसर की शुरुआत हम पारंपरिक दीप प्रज्वलन से करेंगे, जो ज्ञान और प्रकाश की ओर हमारे सतत प्रयास का एक प्रतीक है।
Now I invite Professor Amar Farooqui, our respected principal sir, and esteemed faculty members to join us for the lamp lighting ceremony. Mohapatra here. Sir, we are honored to have you. With the lamp lit, we now take a moment to express our gratitude to our esteemed guests. We would like to present them with a plant and a memento as a token of gratitude. So, firstly, I request Dr. Sanjay Kumar to present a plant and the principal a token of gratitude to our chief guest, Professor Amar Farooqui.
Vanchika.
Moving on, I would request Dr. Puneet Yadav to present a plant to Professor Prabhu, Prasad, Mohapatra and a moment token of appreciation. Ajit sir, would you? Hello. Now I would extend an invitation to our respected principal, Professor Dinesh Khattar, to address the audience.
Respected guests sitting on the dais, esteemed faculty members, dear students, very good morning to all of you. It's really my privilege to stand before you today as we gather for the Professor K.M. Ashraf Memorial Lecture. A lot has been said just now by both our presenters. I will just add, this annual lecture is not only a tribute to a visionary historian, but also a reaffirmation of our collective commitment to academic excellence and historical inquiry. Now coming to today's topic is both thought-provoking and essential, as it sheds light on how history has been shaped and sometimes distorted by those in power. It's my privilege to extend a very warm welcome to our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Amar Farooqui, from the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Delhi. Professor Farooqui is a renowned historian, and his work has significantly contributed to our understanding of colonialism and resistance in India. Sir, we are truly fortunate to have you with us today to share your insights on how British colonial officials constructed narratives around the revolt of 1857, after often portraying it from their own limited perspectives, rather than acknowledging the full complexity of the events. Famous British writer, journalist, and critic George Orwell wisely said, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." The accounts written by colonial officials during and after the revolt of 1857 serve as a reminder of how historical narratives are often shaped by those in power. These writings, presented as objective records, frequently downplayed the brutality of the suppression and disregarded the voices of those who resisted. Today's lecture, I'm sure, will help us critically examine these narratives and reclaim perspectives that were marginalized. I would also like to take a moment to recognize and appreciate the efforts of the entire Department of History for organizing this insightful session, especially Dr. Sanjay Kumar, the Staff Advisor of History Society, and the students who have worked very hard to make it a success. So your hard work and commitment to academic excellence have made this event possible. To paraphrase the great scientist Carl Sagan, what he said, "Somewhere something incredible is waiting to be known. It is through such initiatives that we continue to expand our knowledge and challenge historical assumptions." So I encourage all of you, students, scholars, and faculty members, to engage actively in today's discussion. Let us listen, question, and critically analyze the narratives that have shaped our understanding of history. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, "A nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people." Understanding our history with clarity and depth is a crucial step forward towards preserving that culture. So with that, I once again welcome Sir to Kirori College, and I look forward to an enlightening session with you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Moving on, I request Dr. Sanjay Verma to kindly invite Professor Amar Farooqui on the stage.
So I have been tasked with probably the most difficult thing, inviting historian of analysis, Professor Farooqui, and an excellent teacher. You rarely find these two combinations. That professor who is as eminent as any other historian around us, and equally an excellent teacher. If you look at the BU website, it gives us some idea as his area of interest, of like specialization, modern Indian history, urban history, and of course opium. Right? It may sound a little confusing, opium, but that opium has led to at least 4 books. Right? But in that list itself, you will find one particular book which you all are aware of. You were first introduced to Professor Farooqui through that particular book on early social policy. I mean, any student who has done history honors knows who Mr. Farooqui is, or who Farooqui sir is. Not Professor Farooqui. Who Farooqui is. So I don't have to introduce him. I don't have to keep on listing his publications, almost 8 or 9 books, and multiple research papers and articles. That will take a longer time. I do not want to stand between you and him here. I request him to please come and address you. And only one thing which I would like to add. You meet any of his students, and they will tell you, yes, this is background. Yeah, what I was saying, any of his students, whether they were his students at Conference College, or their students sitting here also from the faculty. And you will know that he is much more than what I have told you right now. An eminent historian, an excellent teacher, and much more than that, a brilliant person. Right? You can call him Professor Amar Farooqui, you can call him Farooqui Sir, you can call him Farooqui Sir. He is comfortable with all of them. Sir, Farooqui Sir, please, sir.
Thank you for that very, very generous and may I say largely undeserved introduction.
I can read, I had written something. I cannot read from there. So I can once again come over there.
Honorable Principal Sir, distinguished colleagues, friends, मैं करोड़ीमल कॉलेज के इतिहास विभाग अपने कॉलीग्स का बहुत आभारी हूँ कि मुझे इस प्रेस्टिजियस मेमोरियल लेक्चर के लिए आमंत्रित किया और मुझे ये अवसर दिया कि मैं आपसे कुछ बात कर सकूं, कुछ इन पहलुओं पर जिनके बारे में मैं कई साल मैं 1857 के विद्रोह पर एक कोर्स पढ़ाता रहा हूँ। तो कुछ प्रश्न हैं जो मैं आपसे शेयर करना चाहता हूँ। मैं सर आपने तो मेरा काम बहुत आसान कर दिया क्योंकि मेरी आर्ग्यूमेंट्स आपने समराइज कर दी और जो संदर्भ विशेषकर स्टूडेंट्स को ये आवश्यक है वो आपने प्रस्तुत कर दिया, तो मेरा काम बहुत आसान हो गया है। The reason why I thought I would speak on this aspect is because Dr. Ashraf himself has contributed to our understanding of the revolt by writing something on it. I'll make a reference to that. So that is one of the reasons why I thought I might speak on this, but also because there are larger issues when we talk about 1857. There are larger issues of history writing which we would be sort of addressing in looking at this historiography. My focus is exclusively on writings by colonial officials. So I'm not looking at their critiques and how subsequently historical writings have evolved, but there are issues which I think are important because many of them get overlooked in writings on the revolt, which relate specifically to the use of sources, the way these sources are presented, and the kind of framework within which this historical writing takes place. I would like to begin by saying a few words about Dr. K.M. Ashraf as a humble tribute to this illustrious freedom fighter, teacher, and thinker in whose memory today's lecture has been organized. Dr. Ashraf was born in Daryapur village near Aligarh in 1903. After completing his MA and LLB, he went to London for his PhD and enrolled at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where Wolseley Hay was his supervisor. हमारे generation के जो history पढ़ी है, it's a familiar name for us. It's not really for the younger generation a very familiar name. So I'll just say something about this historian. Hay was a colonial bureaucrat. Primarily, he's a bureaucrat, military officer, and academic. But he was also an academic. He was the editor of the third volume of the Cambridge History of India, which deals with the period of the Delhi Sultanate, and he translated Badayuni's Mantakhabut Tawarikh into English. So that's an important text, and we still continue to use this translation. K.M. Ashraf's thesis was on the social life of India between 1200 and 1550. So he's also looking at the period mainly of the Sultanate, which he wrote from a perspective that was very different from that of his supervisor. So he actually undermines his supervisor's perspective in his work. The thesis was later published under the title Life and Conditions of the People of Hindustan by the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1936, and subsequently has been issued in various editions brought out by different publishers. It's still in print. This pioneering study on the subject remains a classic. During his stay in London, Dr. Ashraf maintained a close relationship with freedom fighters based in Britain and other parts of Europe. After his return to India in the early 1930s, he became more actively involved in the freedom movement. He was initially sort of participated in the non-cooperation movement in the 1920s. Dr. Ashraf was elected as Secretary of the All India Congress Committee in 1936. Subsequently, he joined the Communist Party, of which he remained a member till his death. He was imprisoned by the British Indian government in 1940 and was in jail for 2 years. While in jail, he undertook a 30-day hunger strike, which, along with the appalling conditions in prison, damaged his health. Following independence, K.M. Ashraf continued to combine his political work with research and teaching. He presided over the medieval section of the Indian History Congress at the session of 1960. His presidential address was a masterly survey of trends in the historiography on medieval India, in the course of which he highlighted some of the key issues that historians need to address for a better understanding of the period. Reflecting on historical methods, he also has a lot to say on historical method. He underlined that, and I quote, "It is neither possible nor desirable to collect data without some perspective, particularly where our social history is concerned," and went on to point out that every student of social history starts, wrongly or rightly, with a generalized concept and a perspective. A generalized concept or image, however, is something like a distant landmark, which we keep in sight at the outset and which becomes more distinct as our collection of factual data advances. Only when we have made an exhaustive study of all available materials can an historical problem or period be grasped in its concrete reality. But this method of work, and this is very important, but this method of work should not be confused with the adoption of preconceived notions or some dogmatic assumption around which to elaborate supporting evidence. We must be prepared for the outlines of our landmark to change as we approach and view it from a fresh angle. Dr. Ashraf taught at KM College in the late 1950s and then shifted to the German Democratic Republic, where he became professor of medieval history at Humboldt University in Berlin. He died in June 1962 and was buried in Berlin in the cemetery of socialists. Professor Sarup Singh, who was for several years principal of KM College and later became Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, was a colleague and close friend of Dr. Ashraf. This might be an appropriate occasion to quote a few sentences from Dr. Singh's reminiscences of KM Ashraf. And I quote, "It is not easy for me to talk of Dr. Ashraf's stay at Colonial College. He was not merely an outstanding historian and a remarkable teacher. He was, for us, a real event. Within a few weeks of his arrival in Delhi, a fresh breeze started blowing in the study of medieval Indian history in the University of Delhi. He became the center of a real creative movement. Students and teachers clustered around him, and Colonial College came to be known almost throughout the country as Ashraf's College. We all basked in the sunshine of his friendship. I, as principal, more than others. I depended on him for advice and guidance, and we both achieved what could perhaps be described in the circumstances as an ideal solution of many problems. I do not know whether I could have prevented his leaving Colonial College, but I shall not forgive myself for having been away from the college when it happened." He had gone on leave at that time. "Our staff lounge is no more the same. Our Holi is not going to be the same anymore. He was always our first target on that day. And on all other occasions, how we shall miss him. He placed Colonial College not merely on the map of India, he has done much more. Through him, we are a part of history." Actually, I'm very glad to hear the very detailed account of this memorial lecture, which is what historians should do. The social histories are very, very important. So there was great sort of, obviously, effort went into preparing that note. In his reminiscences, Professor Sarup Singh, आपको शायद मालूम नहीं होगा इस generation को, Professor Sarup Singh was a very sort of important scholar of English literature. उनका subject history नहीं था, उनका literature subject था. Professor भी रहे दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में history के, English के. In his reminiscences, Professor Sarup Singh also spoke of Dr. Ashraf's easy familiarity with Urdu and Persian poetry, and referred to his being in his own right a man of letters. Many people, Professor Sarup Singh remarks, perhaps do not know. So he was a literature person. He had interest in what Dr. Ashraf did in that field also. Many people perhaps do not know that he wrote plays and features. One of these was so outstanding on the life of Mirza Ghalib that it became a real sensation when the BBC broadcast a portion of it. It is therefore not surprising, now that is the quotation, it is therefore not surprising that K.M. Ashraf should have given his understanding of poetry, of Ghalib. It is therefore not surprising that K.M. Ashraf should have contributed an important essay on Ghalib and the Revolt of 1857 in the volume of articles edited by P.C. Joshi, published in 1957, entitled Rebellion 1857, a Symposium. The essay is a valuable assessment of a historian. The essay is a valuable assessment of a literary composition by Ghalib, his Dastambo, as a historical source. This is a major non-colonial source for reconstructing the history of the inner city in the first few months of its reconquest in September 1857. Those who are not aware of the chronology, it may be mentioned that Delhi was under rebel control for 4 months from 11 May to 14 September 1857. And the city was the population was driven out after that. But it so happened by a certain historical accident, which I can't go into over here, that Ghalib stayed in Delhi during the period that it was kind of the population was driven out. And he wrote this account, which is what Ashraf was writing about. Ghalib was present in Shahjahanabad throughout the summer of 1857 when it was held by the Sipahi. So he's there when the Sipahis hold it. But subsequently he lived through the devastation of the city caused by the British. All this while he remained confined to his house in Ballimaran, if you're familiar with that part of the city. All this while he remained confined to his house and kept himself occupied by recording his experiences and feelings in the form of notes in Persian. He was not the kind of person who would have remained indifferent to what was happening around him. Ghalib later published an edited version of these notes as a book with the title Dastambo, or Bouquet of Flowers. There are in this edited version two parallel narratives. One superficially pro-establishment, because it is actually meant for presentation to British officials. The other profoundly anti-colonial. It is beyond my capacities to unravel its multiple layers of meaning. It's a very difficult text. Dastambo cannot exactly be called a diary. This highly acclaimed literary product is considered to be the preeminent Persian prose work of Ghalib, in which he attempted to use pure Persian words, eschewing Arabic words and terms. So there's a large Arabic vocabulary in Persian, which Ghalib was trying to avoid. So it's a kind of literary experiment that he's engaged in, linguistic experiment. This highly, hence Dastambo is at one level the result of an arduous linguistic experiment that cannot be read as a straightforward narrative of the revolt. In his essay, Dr. Ashraf noted that, and I quote, as it now stands, the record of events in Ghalib's diary is all too brief and does not mention some important matters that were common knowledge. It is particularly inadequate in its treatment of all significant developments. It hardly mentions major developments in Delhi. It looks as if the author had no leisure to rewrite his diary. He was in a great hurry to present it to British officials. It looks as if the author had no leisure to rewrite his diary and confined himself to deleting some passages and interpolating a few afterthoughts, all evidently to save his skin. So he couldn't have been critical at all. Dr. Ashraf also contributed another article to the volume. Muslim revivalists and the revolt of 1857. I do not propose to discuss his argument in that essay. Dalrymple in his last Mughal made substantial use of the argument without any kind of acknowledgement, except that there's a reference to the article in his bibliography. There are problems with that argument. I'm not sort of getting into that. A critique of it based on further research has been offered recently by Iqtidar Alam Khan. However, I wish to draw attention to William Dalrymple's contention. So this is about sources, not the argument that he used. However, I wish to draw attention to William Dalrymple's contention in his last Mughal that histories of the revolt, incidentally, those who might be interested, maybe you know this, there's a good Hindi translation of that book also. However, I wish to draw attention to William Dalrymple's contention in his last Mughal that histories of the revolt, written in the English language in post-colonial India, tended to use only English language sources. The Urdu histories written by contemporary, and this I am quoting Dalrymple, the Urdu histories written by contemporary Muslim scholars in India and Pakistan, on the other hand, tend to make use of an entirely separate and often very rich seam of Urdu primary sources. I shall leave aside the question of Dalrymple's use of the label Muslim for scholars writing histories of the revolt in Urdu. That's a different issue. But what his statement implies is that before him, that's before Dalrymple, no one writing on the revolt in English has consulted non-English language sources. And he cites, as an example, he cites Zahir Dehlvi's Dastan-e-Ghadar to substantiate this claim. This is a useful contemporary source and is among the accounts that Dalrymple has relied on heavily. Had he gone through the references in Ashraf's article carefully, the essays listed in the bibliography, he would have found that the importance of the memoir had already been recognized 50 years earlier and was used by Dr. Ashraf along with a large number of other non-English language sources. So writing in English, what Dalrymple is saying that writing in English uses different kinds of sources, they are unaware of Urdu sources. But in fact, what Ashraf did was, in that very small essay, he used Urdu sources and non-English language sources very extensively, many of which actually Dalrymple hasn't even perhaps seen. We need to note that Ashraf's two articles on 1857 were representative of pioneering scholarly writings on the subject, which began to appear after independence. These, unlike the writings of the latter half of the 19th century, were based on rigorous research undertaken by trained historians who used multiple sources and engaged critically with these sources. On the other hand, in the 50 years after the revolt, a large number of so-called histories were produced by colonial officials who happened to be weekend historians. So this they did as a kind of leisure time activity. For a long time, undergraduate history students were asked a question in the Modern India paper on the revolt of 1857. I am talking of time when I began teaching, so please, this has no reference to your experiences. My experiences, and I'm sure Prabhu and some of my generics would know this better. For a long time, undergraduate history students were asked a question in the Modern India paper on the revolt of 1857, which required them to discuss either the causes or the nature of the revolt. And usually it was kind of alternated.
Cause and nature together.
This standard, and of course, as my teacher, Professor Prasad used to say, very difficult. Nature is a philosophical question, so it's a difficult question to answer in. the standard format of the answer was more or less the same for both questions. Students were expected to list the views of writers or public figures who had something to say about the revolt over a period of about 100 years from the late 1850s to the 1950s, devoting one or two sentences to each viewpoint. A sentence, B sentence, C sentence, one or two sentences on that. And mind you, even in the 1980s, 1990s, they were still stuck at 1950s as far as writings were concerned. There was usually no context, so that Disraeli's well-known statement that the decline of empires are not affairs of greased cartridges was quoted in a manner which suggested that this was part of a radical denunciation of colonial rule, overlooking the fact that Disraeli himself was an arch-imperialist. When the debate on Indian affairs commenced in the British Parliament on 27 July 1857, soon after news of the mutiny in the company's army reached London, Disraeli, who led the Tories in the House of Commons, had demanded an immediate discussion on the issue in the House and used the discussion to embarrass the Whigs who were in power. The ministry was headed by Lord Palmerston. Disraeli blamed the Whigs for mismanaging empire and not speaking as someone opposed to empire. So this is important because he's just talking about what the mismanagement by the Whigs of the empire. In the undergraduate answers, there was also no sense of chronology, so that views from different decades were lumped together without any sequence. G.W. Forrest, whose work came out in 1904, might precede T. Rice Holmes, whose book was published in the 1880s. Besides, many writings are erroneously categorized as accounts penned by historians. We might suppose, when we are looking at this kind of catalogue in answers, we might suppose that Charles Ball or L.E.R. Rees, who are among the most familiar names and mentioned most frequently among the earliest authors, were actually historians. As we shall see, this is not the case. Neither were John Kay or George Mallison trained historians. I'll come to all these people in a moment. Yet their influence has been enormous. This is one of the reasons why the historiography on the revolt is still quite underdeveloped. We need to take a closer look at the so-called histories and their authors, whose works entirely dominated the field for nearly a century and which are still at times quoted reverentially to explain the paradox of such little meaningful history when the quantity of published writings is so very large. Any decent library would have 2 or 3 shelves on 1857. Janice Ludendorff, in her 1966 bibliography of English language materials on the subject, this is a very useful bibliography, but it's very outdated because it was published in 1966. She put together all the materials she could find in the English language on the revolt. Janice Ludendorff, in her 1966 bibliography of English language materials on the subject, listed as many as 990 books in English alone, and the list has grown exponentially. The earliest detailed account, so what I'll be doing is just talking about 2 or 3 significant works as examples. The earliest detailed account of the upheavals of 1857-58 was a 2-volume work entitled The History of the Indian Mutiny, authored by Charles Ball. So Charles Ball's name appears invariably in most writings. Very early work, huge volume, 1300 words, 1300 pages, and these are big volumes. This was a journalistic work of over 1300 pages, illustrated with nearly 75 black and white steel engravings and containing a double-leaf, partially colored map of India. I have not been able to find any information about Charles Ball as a historian. Other than that, he was co-author with William Stafford of an illustrated volume on Italy, published in circa 1840 by the same publisher as that of History of the Indian Mutiny, namely the London Printing and Publishing Company. That's the publisher of his work. It is quite likely that this is a collective work to which several authors coordinated by Ball contributed. Originally, the account was published in serial form with the title The Mutiny in India. The separate issues, and there were almost 40 issues, the separate issues have 2 illustrations per number. So this someone sitting in England sort of using descriptions to provide illustrations. The front cover of the original issue had an image of Henry Havelock, and it is reasonable to assume that the work began to be issued soon after the recapture of Kanpur in mid-July 1857, perhaps sometime late 1857. The same cover was retained throughout. Havelock had acquired an iconic status in Britain as the hero of Kanpur. He led the British force which recaptured the city from the rebels who had held it for a month and a half. Inhabitants were massacred indiscriminately by Havelock's troops. When they entered Kanpur on 17 July 1857. Havelock subsequently died of dysentery on the outskirts of Lucknow in November 1857 during the campaign to occupy Lucknow and evacuate Europeans from the city. He is buried there. Ball's History of the Indian Mutiny was published simultaneously from England and the United States. The entire set of the serialized version was later combined in 2 volumes. Subscribers, issues were available through subscription, could get installments bound by following instructions provided by the publisher. This was standard practice at that time. The London print, Charles Dickens published a large number of novels in serialized form, Anthony Trollope, and so on. The London Printing and Publishing Company marketed the projected volumes by inviting subscriptions for the several parts in which the work was to be published. This was a common practice in the mid-19th century. Another work being published almost at the same time by the same publisher was Robert Montgomery Martin's The Indian Empire. This was a very well-known work, and orders were often solicited together for both. Not only did the regular publication of the installments delivered to subscribers every fortnight over a period of 1.5 years sustain interest in the revolt and its suppression, it disseminated widely the official version of events. Ball's Indian Mutiny became, along with similar other writings which we shall discuss, propaganda material for the East India Company. Readers got to know about events as the story unfolded, although not exactly in real time. The narrative commences with the developments of the early months of 1857 in Bengal and continues right up to June 1859. The last issue, those of you who might again not know this, actually Tatya Tope and in central India continued to elude the British and engage in a kind of guerrilla campaign, and in Western Bihar, the legendary Kumar Singh's brother after his death, Amar Singh, he also continued with this guerrilla campaign. So 1857 is when the campaign, the final operations the British are being carried out against Satya Tope in central India and Amar Singh in Western Bihar. The last issue contains a brief report on the resignation in June 1859 of the minority Tory government headed by Lord Derby. The Derby ministry had piloted the legislation, that's what we know as the Act of August 1858, which brought to an end the company's role in the governance of the Indian Empire, placing the government directly under the crown. Ball's history is a massive compendium which puts together a vast amount of information from a variety of sources such as parliamentary reports, newspaper articles, letters from officials in India, which were in the public domain and includes a long account of the history of British rule in India. Needless to say, the information is presented in an undigested form. This was mostly information that the British government chose to share with the public. Another widely quoted account that was, so it's no history really, another widely quoted account that was published even as the campaigns against the rebels were still in progress was a book entitled Personal Narrative of the Siege of Lucknow by L.E.R. Rees, published in 1858. This is a useful primary source, but not the history of the events at Lucknow. Rees was a merchant based in Lucknow who had connections with Kanpur and Calcutta. His business extended to these places. He was at Lucknow when the Sipahis liberated the city, and like a large number of other Europeans residing in the former capital of Amar, took shelter in the residency compound which the rebels besieged for several months. To treat his statements as those of a historian assessing the revolt is a problem. Yet, that is what we find in standard textbook accounts. A well-known coaching center, I was just doing a Google search while writing this. A well-known coaching center, I won't name this, it's a very well-known center, announced, sort of reinvented itself. A very well-known coaching center, for instance, in its study material relating to the revolt, available on its website, places the views of Rees on the causes of the mutiny at the beginning of a section entitled Observations by British Historians on the Revolt of 1857. And by the way, this is not just this coaching center, I found that it's repeated in several other centers which have their study material on this. The foundations of colonial historiography on the revolt were laid by the immensely influential work of John W. Kay, entitled A History of the Sepoy War in India, 1857-1858. Kay was a colonial official and a military historian. During the writing of the history of the revolt, he received considerable support from the ruling establishment, the colonial establishment, which placed a huge amount of official documentation at his disposal. Kay also made use of the accounts of British officials, both military and civilian, who were involved in the campaign to crush the uprising. The first volume of History of the Sepoy War was published in 1864. Two subsequent volumes were published in 1870 and 1876, respectively. Kay passed away in 1876, by which time he had only completed the story of the revolt in Delhi. These are big volumes, usually around 600, 700 pages, and had provided details about the early phase of the developments in Awadh, including Lucknow. It may be mentioned here that the first volume was entirely devoted to a lengthy discussion on the historical background to the revolt, beginning with the mid-1840s and sort of then going up to late 1850s, mid-1850s, Dalhousie and so on, in the early months of Canada. Following Kay's death, another colonial official who was also an amateur historian, with several books to his credit, George Mallison, published a 3-volume history of the revolt entitled History of the Indian Mutiny. And there's a significant subtitle to that. Commencing from the close of the second volume, History of the Indian Mutiny, commencing from the close of the second volume of Sir John Kay's History of the Sepoy War. This was published in 1878-1880. This is significant because, in a sense, he appropriates the reputation of Kay. So, if I was to write something and then sort of put the Dalrymple in the subtitle, I might get a larger audience. So, but there's a reason why he's doing this. He published 3 volumes. So he's saying that it commences from the end of the second volume of Sir John Kay's History of the Sepoy War. Simultaneously, I'll come to that in a moment. Simultaneously, a comprehensive index of the two histories, that's Kay's history, Sepoy War, and Mallison's history, was issued in 1880, thereby firmly linking these two separate works. Later, the histories of K and Malleson together with a revised version of the index were all brought together as a 6-volume set published in 1889 with the title K's and Malleson's History of the Indian Mutiny, with Malleson as the editor of these combined volumes. I'm sure Cambridge College has an old set of this in the reference section. This was done at the instance of the prominent London publisher W.H. Allen, who had undertaken publication of all these works. According to Malleson, the publisher had approached him for continuing with the unfinished volumes of K, the very day on which I returned to England from India after my retirement from the service in 1877. So K passed away in 76, 77, Malleson, after retiring from India, he served in India. I'll say something about that also. He is offered this, requested to write this. Continue. In the process of consolidating the volumes, the third volume of K's History of the Sepoy War was dropped. Malleson, in his preface to the first volume of his own History of the Indian Mutiny, says that he had formed his views about the mutiny 22 years earlier. This is important for historical writing. 22 years earlier, and that he had no reason to revise them. Some of these views, he states, did not correspond with those of K, which was the main reason for dropping the third volume. So it's a very serious disagreement with the third volume. I don't have time to go into what those disagreements were, but he had a serious sort of disagreement with many of the ways in which K had written his third volume. A large part of it actually deals with the annexation of Awadh in 1856, that the responses to that, popular resentment, and he didn't sort of find that too palatable. Malleson, when he's saying 22 years earlier I formed this opinion, and I have not revised it for 22 years, I have not revised this opinion. So what had he written 22 years earlier? Malleson had anonymously published a pamphlet which has come to be known as the Red Pamphlet as early as July 1857, when Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow were still under the control of rebels. He had already published that. He was at that time a very junior officer in the company's army with the rank of lieutenant. That's the lowest rank at which you start in the army. That time in the company's army. Posted in the military audit department. He was doing a desk job in Calcutta. Even a cursory glance at the pamphlet would show that he was merely retailing of office gossip. I mean, the reason I'm making this point is because this actually appears, right, a pamphlet as a very serious history of the revolt. When it's written, by whom it's written, what it has to say, I think that these are important things which historians need to ponder over. He was retailing of his gossip about who ought to be held responsible for the outbreak of the mutiny in the Bengal army. Actually, there's a lot of very juicy gossip in this about, very senior members of the colonial establishment, particularly those who were members of the Governor General's Council and what they were doing in that kind of thing. So it's actually very interesting that way. He seems to, and he couldn't have published it otherwise than anonymously. He seems to have been close to officials, but there's also an angle to this, you see. He seems to have been close to officials associated with the anti-Dalhousie faction which supported Charles Napier. I know this is very old-fashioned kind of history, looking for factions and factions with which people are aligned, but I think it's worth seeing, what his various sympathies were. Tensions between Dalhousie and Napier, especially over policies to be pursued in Punjab, were common knowledge, and Malleson declares his loyalty to the Napier faction by mentioning in the place of the author on the title page of the pamphlet, by one who has served under Charles Napier. So he doesn't give his name, he simply says by one who has served under Charles Napier, so that thereby declares his sort of loyalty. As a junior officer, he could have not had any access to confidential records. and could only have relied on hearsay, mostly office chit-chat, for writing his account in his spare time. This certainly cannot be regarded as a history of the mutiny. That's in the Bengal army. K's credentials were somewhat better. He had already established his reputation as a military historian with his 2-volume history of the First Afghan War, published in 1851, and was the author of a history of the administration of the East India Company, and he also wrote a biography of another prominent official, Charles Metcalfe. He was a fairly high-ranking official who had started his career as an officer in the Bengal Army, shifted to journalism and writing, and then joined the home service of the company. So the company's establishment in London also had its own sort of bureaucrat. After the Crown took over the Indian government, he became the head of the political and secret department of the India Office. That's the Office of the Secretary of State for India. And this political and secret department was a key department of the colonial state. So it actually accessed some very, very important material. He was given full access to official records for writing his history and expressed his gratitude to Charles Wood, same person, Wood Dispatch. But that's before the revolt. And expressed his gratitude to Charles Wood, Secretary of State for India and the Palmerston administration, for allowing him to freely consult the relevant source material. However, the volumes, so he says that I have great access, and this is an important point, and that's sort of the main issue point that I want to make actually. So he says that I had access to all this material. It was given, he's acknowledging Charles Wood, who gave him free access, and these are very important files. Allison never had any access of that kind. However, the volumes are based to a large extent on his personal conversations with military and civilian officials and his private correspondence with various people who had information about the events of the revolt or military campaigns. Official documents are used by him only occasionally. The book has very few references. K's unprofessional approach to sources while writing his history may be seen in his lengthy statement in the preface to the first volume of History of the Sepoy War, published 1864, where he justifies. So there's hardly any references. So in the preface, he actually justifies the absence of references on the grounds that his credibility as a historian was already established with his history of the war in Afghanistan. So he's already published this big, massive work in which he did provide sources, but now I'm a big man, now I'm well recognized, therefore I don't need to provide sources. So historians, this is a comforting thought. Historians, after a particular stage don't need to cite sources. That's what he's saying. So the absence of references on the ground that his credibility as a historian was established with his history of the war in Afghanistan, and he was not required to provide references. It would be worthwhile to quote his statement at length. And I think this is an important statement because when we see this as an important statement, we also need to see how he's approaching his sources and history writing. So I'm quoting K. The prodigal citation, abundant. Citation of authorities has its advantages, but it encumbers the text. अच्छा नहीं लगता कि आप बार-बार reference देखना पड़े. It impedes the narrative and swells to inordinate dimensions the record of historical events. On a former occasion, when I laid before the public an account of a series of important transactions, he's referring to his history of the war in Afghanistan, that's the first Afghan war, mainly derived from original documents, public and private, I quoted those documents freely, both in the text and in the notes. So there he acted the professional story. As I was at that time wholly unknown to the public, this is the important point he's making. As I was at that time wholly unknown to the public, it was necessary that I should cite chapter and verse to obtain credence about my statement. It seemed to be imperative upon me, therefore, to produce my credentials. But believing that this necessity no longer exists, now I'm a famous person, I have in the present work abstained from adducing my authorities for the mere purpose of substantiating my statements. I've quoted the voluminous correspondence in my possession only when, in my possession, it's not in a public repository. And what there's some specific material that he's referring to. I've quoted the voluminous correspondence in my possession only where there is some dramatic force and propriety in the words cited or when they appear calculated without impeding the narrative to give color and vitality to the story. That's interesting, so it spices up the narrative. As on former occasions, the historical materials which I have molded into this narrative are rather of a private. Now this is a very important point. So you say, I had access to all that material, but I haven't used it. And I must sort of acknowledge my gratitude to Professor Shahid Amin, who long back wrote an essay on K's volumes in Biblio. I don't know whether it's easily available now any longer. I don't possess a copy of it, but if you can locate it, it's a very useful article he wrote on K volume, where he actually drew attention to this fact that he's not using the official documents to which he has access. And vitality of the story. As on former occasions, the historical materials which I have molded into this narrative are of a private rather than a public character. I have made but little use of recorded official state documents. I do not mean that access to such documents has not been extremely serviceable to me. It's been useful. Those documents have been useful to me. But that it has rather afforded the means of verifying or correcting statements received from other sources than it has supplied me with original documents. So I have not used it. I just need to sort of cross-check some dates and so on. But to no one am I more indebted. So he actually acknowledges Charles Wood that he had given me this full access. But to no one I am more indebted than to Sir Charles Wood, Secretary of State for India, who has permitted me to consult the official records of his department, a privilege which has enabled me to make much better use of the more private materials in my possession. So as historians we know, if we have access to very sort of important materials, then it's a kind of gold mine for these stories. But he had that gold mine, he didn't use it, except occasionally. He uses his private documentation, which also he doesn't cite. It's there in his private collection, but he doesn't really let us know what kind of material, what correspondence, what. So historians, when they cite, when you go, some of you go on to be researchers, you will know that historians need, when they're citing a document, they need to mention the date, they need to mention the kind of document, if it's a letter, who wrote to whom, you need to mention the series, कौन सी कहाँ फाइल को है, कौन सी series में है, Home Department, Revenue Department, and Military Department. You also need to mention the location. If it's in the National Archives of India, then you need to mention National Archives of India. You need to mention where National Archives of India is located. You need to say New Delhi. So all that information is required. That's what a professional historian does. And that is the way in which references are provided. Madison too has hardly any references. A lengthy letter might at times be quoted, but there is no indication as to where the letter might be found. We should remember that the purpose of a reference, one of the reasons is, it's not just credibility. One of the reasons is, we should remember that the purpose of a reference is to enable another person to verify what a writer has stated. So you should be able to go to the archive, look up the same file, same document, verify, and not just verify, you might have very different interpretation of that document. So that's the purpose of providing footnotes. It's not just because it adds the bulk of a book, it's very important. And I might just remark over here that these days this task has become a little difficult because when publishers don't provide footnotes, because historians as they move along, they like to always constantly read the text and keep glancing at the note below to see where, what's the sources. अभी वो पीछे डाल देते हैं फिर, you are lazy, छोड़ो, कौन देखेगा. So, the 6th volume came, but this didn't happen in the times of K, you did have proper footnotes, at the foot, at the bottom of the page. The 6th-volume K. Mallison account immediately became the authorized version of the history of that tumultuous phase of British rule in India, holding sway with its numerous editions, reprints, and abridgments till 1947 and even beyond. For example, the fifth edition of the first volume was published simultaneously with the second volume of the work in 1870. So when K wrote the Sepoy War, when the second volume was published in 1870, simultaneously the fifth edition of the first volume was also published. This is a sort of great bestseller. It's not surprising that Mallison immediately tried to sort of appropriate that popularity. 4 editions had already been issued in the preceding 6 years, an enviable success for any writer. The 2 original works by K and Mallison also continued to be published separately. Several editions of K's History of the Sepoy War were published after his death and continued to be much in demand. This is a history, and this is also important to note. What is this history there? I can't go into the details of the argument. Principal साहब ने बहुत हमारा काम बहुत आसान कर दिया क्योंकि he's given you an idea about what colonial historians are writing about. So this doesn't require more elaboration. But this history, that's also an important point. This is a history of the suppression of the revolt rather than a history of the revolt. That's why in the title I wrote narratives of suppression. This is a history of the suppression of the revolt rather than history of the revolt, and became the model for all subsequent writings which propagated the colonial version of events of 1857-59. I'm just coming to the end of my talk. So these are all sort of the huge amount of material that you have is really about, what we have done to suppress the revolt. It's not about what the rebels were doing. Obviously, when you talk about suppression, you have to talk about rebels occasionally. Towards the end of the 19th century, 2 works, and I conclude with this, 2 works by the same author further reinforced this colonial narrative about suppression. The author, G.W. Forrest, I mentioned him earlier, was also a colonial official. Forrest, who was born in India, so these are, in those answers that I was referring to, usually these are the most familiar. You would have Charles Ball, you would have Mallison, but the reference to his red pamphlet, you would have K, you would have Mallison, you would have another author, P. Rice Holmes, who skipped in this presentation, you would have G.W. Forrest. So over a period of roughly 50 years, these are the main authors who hold dominant. So the author G.W. Forrest was also a colonial official. Forrest, who was born in India, was employed in the education department of the Bombay government, was census commissioner of Bombay in 1882 for the census of 1882, that's the Bombay presidency, and was appointed director of government records. He made very good use of the material that he has provided in the Bombay archive. In fact, there's a huge series called Selections from the Records of the Bombay government, which was coordinated by Forrest. So he, for historians, the archival work he's done is actually interesting. It is very sort of important. He briefly taught history. I was doing again a kind of Google search and I found that he's now referred to as father of Indian archives. Forrest. So there's Cornwallis mentioned as father of Indian civil service, and Forrest as father of Indian archives. But it's a more complicated story about what he was doing with the archives, which is what I'll just quickly talk about and conclude. He briefly taught English history at Elphinstone College, returning to Britain in 1900. At the beginning of the 1890s, he was entrusted with the task of, so this is a task that is given by a very senior official of the army, who was the military member actually of the Governor General's Council. At the beginning of the 1890s, he was entrusted the task of compiling records pertaining to the revolt that were part of the files of the military department of the company's government. The company had this military department which contained a huge amount of records. Now, mind you, this is only military department, so it is only about military operations and what military officials are saying. So it's on the basis of that we can put these together, and then he also wrote a history which I'll just mention. A collection of these documents was published in 4 volumes under the title Selections from the Letters, Dispatches and Other State Papers Preserved in the Military Department of the Government of India, 1857-58. So these are very specific documents from a particular department in which the military, the senior military official was interested that he should put them together to show what the army was doing. So it's not in no way a history of military, it's only part of the longer history, the larger history of the revolt. The first volume came out in 1893 and the final volume in 1912. So it took a long time for this to be put together. As the project progressed, Forrest decided to use this archive with which he was already familiar, along with the vast amount of other published material, to write another detailed history of the revolt. This was a reflection of the continuing interest in the subject and the existence of a ready-made market for yet another account which purported to be a comprehensive history based on what were regarded as authentic sources. So he's always saying authentic. So this is supposed to be authentic. Forrest's 3-volume History of the Indian Mutiny was published between 1904 and 1912. This marks, so he's in retirement, he thinks, it's a good way to engage his time. So good hints for people who retired. This marked no departure in terms of its focus, since this too is a history of the suppression of the revolt, written entirely from the official British perspective. It may be mentioned that Forrest's father was among the personnel posted at the Army's magazine in Delhi, near the Red Fort, opposite the GPO, AUD campus, whatever sort of the memorial that survives. When the rebels took over the city, he and the other officials of the magazine blew up. Magazine होता है जहाँ ammunition store होता है, जहाँ gunpowder रखा जाता है और हथियार भी रखे जाते हैं. The army's magazine in Delhi near the Red Fort, when the rebels took over the city, he and other officials of the magazine blew up the building when the Sipahis surrounded it, attempting to take it over. So it was very natural. When the Sipahis took over the city in May, they thought, so the first target was, gunpowder hai, wo hum le lein. So, Forrest and the other officials who were inside, they eventually blew up. They set fire to it. Ended in a. This caused a massive explosion. Forrest Senior, that is his father, this writer, was wounded in the explosion, but was able to escape from Delhi. The son would have grown up hearing stories about the incidents at Delhi and other tales about the revolt. So we say conflict of interest. So this is the conflict of interest. But that's the point I'm making, by the way. The book is devoted to the memory, it's to the memory of the author's father, so the dedication is to his father. Nevertheless, Forrest's possible bias is not the main reason for being dismissive of his volumes as a work of history. So there's an obvious bias. It is possible that historian can transcend that bias. Son can write a history which is critical of the father or the father's narrative. So I'm pointing this out, but then the point is, this is not what is important. Though we should be aware, the historian needs to be aware of these contexts. He largely reproduced the versions found in the official records. So actually, here, simultaneously with his history. So he's engaging both in the record as well as in the writing his history. So what he's really doing is, this is a kind of shortcut he's taking to writing his history. He largely reproduced the versions found in the official records, paraphrasing, summarizing, and providing necessary links or background information to present a connected history. So he has all these documents. He's already arranged them sequentially in a chronological order. He's done it thematically. Delhi mein ye hua, Lucknow mein ye hua, Jhansi mein ye hua. Now what he has to do is to just paraphrase and to sort of use some other material and link up this record. That's precisely what he's actually doing. If you read it and if you compare the two texts, you would find that this is precisely what he's doing while he's sort of doing the two jobs. In fact, the fourth volume of his selections that he records was published in the same year as the third volume of his history. So you can see he's doing these two tasks almost simultaneously. This is the work of a propagandist merely adding to the already vast literature on the revolt without telling us anything new about the history of the revolt. We need to constantly keep in view the debilitating impact of colonial rule on the historiography of 1857 for any meaningful attempt to write a history of this great struggle. So it's always a good idea to sort of not begin with those histories when we are sort of talking about, but to see them either as primary sources or the kind of perspective which stifled historical writing and made it difficult to write histories of the revolt. Thank you.
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर, अपने बहुमूल्य विचार हमारे साथ साझा करने के लिए। आपकी उपस्थिति यहाँ मौजूद सभी लोगों के लिए प्रेरणा का स्रोत है।
Would like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Iliyas Husain. Sir, we are delighted to have you here with us. To conclude the lecture, I now invite Dr. Ashraf Kumar for the vote of thanks.
Vote of thanks is a very difficult task, and thank you, quote unquote, would be so formal a word to express our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Amar Farooqui for his outstanding Ashraf lecture on the topic traditions in transition. As Sanjay sir has rightly remarked, he has just said about it that क्या combination है. We see the combinations in Farooqui sir. He is an excellent historian, brilliant teacher, and a brilliant human being. He said it, and Farooqui sir has proved it in his
Proper citation.
Yeah, proper citation. Farooqui sir has, talked about tradition. That Ashraf, Umar Muhammad Ashraf has said, during 1960s, and William Dabrington is the example of tradition in transition. Farooqui sir has talked about, authentic history of colonial period with regard to 1857 revolt by citing n number of examples, be it L.E.R. Rees or John Kay or Mallison or Forrest. But then sir has rightly proved with example that these are not the history of the revolt of 1857, these are the history of the suppression of the revolt of 1857, and those became the bestsellers. So, sir, you are a historian extraordinaire. Sir, your cheerful expression and enthusiastic vibes were unmissable when you went on describing these details about the revolt of 1857. Sir, your approach towards understanding traditions in transition was superb, and the way you expressed your ideas and your views were really, the History Society will remain indebted to you for such an informative and engaging, lecture. Sir, we have heard that your talent of making the most complex aspect so simple remain just untapped. It can easily be inferred from your lecture that you are someone who not just believe in, but also follow the philosophy that teaching is a two-way process, where a teacher is not just a facilitator of knowledge, but also learns from students. So therefore, you recall your days when, there were questions that came to the minds of students that causes and nature of 1857 revolt. And you got it corrected from your teacher that there cannot be, causes and nature at the same time. So on behalf of, and sir, even after superannuation as a teacher, you truly proved to be full of passion and enthusiasm. So on behalf of History Society, we thank you from the core of our heart for, honoring us today by your ever enriching and informative lecture. So you really deserve a huge round of applause. And on the occasion, I would like to thank our one and only principal, sir, who just left a few moments ago. But when he rightly briefed about sir, he rightly he saved Farooqui sir's time in expressing that the history, colonial history or historical narratives are often saved by those in power. So this is what re-emphasized by Farooqui sir. So principal sir will definitely help us, as he promised that he will help us in publishing the proceedings of today's lecture, including famous February lecture and national seminar. So we thank you very much. We also express our heartfelt thanks to the staff advisor of History Society, Dr. Sanjay Kumar, and NTIC of History Society, Dr. Vikram Singh, for their endeavor of taking the lead in organizing the memorable famous February lecture and national seminar. And our sincere thanks is due to the students and volunteers of the History Department. Without their cooperation, it could not have been a success. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.